Damien Parker from Lifestyle HDR sent me this image and asked me to see what I could do with it. This is my workflow, but there's more than one way to do it. I opened the file from Bridge in Adobe Camera Raw. I then applied some lens correction and removed any chromatic aberration. I then used the ruler tool to ensure that the horizon line was horizontal. I then chose the appropriate white balance, in this case, daylight. I then pulled the highlights all the way back. I then had to ascertain a good dynamic range. Now to do this, I played with the exposure slider and decided to go with a range from -0.5 to +1.5. To get 5 component images in this range, I would need to use a spacing of 0.5. I then positioned the exposure slider at what would be the middle component, or +0.5. Now, working from this component, I cranked up the shadows slider to bring more definition into the darker areas of the image, particularly around the base of the Jetty. I then applied a white point correction. Now to do this, I held down the Alt key, or Option on a Mac, and pulled back on the white slider. The highlighted areas on the black area indicate which areas of the image would be treated as the brightest. I then similarly applied a black point correction, holding down the Alt key, again Option on a Mac, and while pulling back on the black slider. The darkened areas on the white area indicate which areas of the image would be treated as the darkest. I then raised the values of the vibrance and saturation sliders. I didn't use the clarity slider on purpose, as I didn't want to bring out any intense details in the water in the foreground. I then raised the amount slider on the sharpening parameters to 100% to make the edge of the image look crisp. I then applied a graduated filter from the top to the bottom of the image, where I applied a slightly blue tinge, pulled back on the exposure and highlight sliders, and increased the clarity and the saturation. I then applied a second graduated filter from the bottom to the top of the image, where I applied a more pronounced blue tinge, pulled up on the exposure, back on the highlights, and increased the clarity and saturation. Because this is a graduated filter, the detail enhancement brought about by increasing the clarity would be most pronounced at the bottom where the sand lies. Now jumping back to the basic image adjustments, I varied the exposure slider from -0.5 to +1.5 with a spacing of 0.5 and created 5 component images, which I saved as full quality JPEGs. Each of these files were assigned a functional name for ease of identification later on in the workflow. Now once done, I closed out of Adobe Camera Raw and opened up Photomatix Pro. I loaded up the 5 created component images into Photomatix. I defined their spacing to Photomatix, in this case, half. I only enabled the Reduce Chromatic Aberrations option in Photomatix. Photomatix takes a few seconds to produce an initial HDR image. I first reset Photomatix to its default settings before working through the individual sliders. Now starting from the top, I raised the strength slider to 90. I set the color saturation to 50 after trying a few different settings. After much trial and almost as much error, I went with a -2.0 with the luminosity slider. I decided to leave the detail contrast slider at 0. After a little more experimentation, I set the lighting adjustment slider to 1. I pulled back on the saturation highlight slider to -2.0. Likewise, I also pulled back on the saturation shadow slider to -1. I then hit process. Photomatix takes a few seconds to create a tone-mapped HDR image, which I then saved as a full-quality JPEG. Closing out of Photomatix, I loaded the tone-mapped HDR image into Photoshop. I also loaded the middle component image that we created in Adobe Camera Raw into Photoshop. I copied the entire middle component image and pasted it into the HDR tone-mapped image as a new layer. Once done, I closed the middle component image. Then, focusing on the tone-mapped HDR image, I turned off the visibility of the new layer and worked from the background layer. I fired up Nik Color Efex Pro. Now I had a saved recipe in Nik Color Efex, but in essence it's made of the following Nik Color Efex filters. The Pro Contrast filter with 50% dynamic range enhancement. A graduated neutral density filter going from the top to the bottom. A polarization filter with 33% polarization. A skylight filter at 20%, and a sunlight filter at 5% intensity with a color temperature of 6800K. Once applied, Nik Color Efex created another layer with the applied effects. Now operating on the new layer, using the Quick Select tool, I selected the area that defined the sky. Once having completed making the selection, I applied 3 pixels of feathering. I then inverted the selection to select the jetty and the waters of the sea. I then activated the layer we created using the middle component image. With the selection still active, I copied and pasted the selection in as a new layer. Selecting this new layer as the active layer, I launched Nik Color Efex. I used the same Nik Color Efex recipe as I had before, but I made a few subtle changes. I pulled the dynamic range enhancement on the Pro Contrast filter back to 10%. On the sunlight filter, I set the color temperature to 7200K. Once applied, Nik Color Efex created another layer with the applied filters. Activating all the layers created by Nik, I flattened the image. I then used Noiseware to apply some noise reduction using the landscape setting. I used DxO viewpoint to crop this image on the principles of the perfect ratio, but you can do this using the crop tool in Photoshop while doing the math yourself. And I finally applied some vignetting using Nik Color Efex. I flattened the image and saved it as a full quality JPEG. So here we are finally with before and after images, but as I said before, there's more than one way to do it.